This week we'll begin talking about modernism. And this is a word you've no doubt heard before, especially if you've taken a course on 20th century literature or art history or philosophy. So modernism is a broad philosophical and artistic movement that was across all of the arts that worked within the transformations of culture that took place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was a critique of modernity and the modern social condition, including industrialization and the new technologizing of all aspects of culture, and especially our relationships to labor, the working on factory lines rather than as craftsmen, and so on. This involved a great rejection of realism in the arts, realistic depictions, well-rounded characters, etc., what we've been looking at so far. And we often think of it in relationship to the death and destruction of the world wars. And we'll see that the types of film we'll be talking about over the next few weeks, including Expressionism, Dada, and Surrealism, as well as Soviet constructivism, all fall under this category of modernism. In modernism and modernist techniques, we see a great throwing off of the traditions and expectations set by the past. And we'll see this very dramatically in the arts, in painting and sculpture, in theater and literature, and so on. There's a great rejection of realism. And we'll see this in film too. And realism is an interesting topic for us studying film and its related technologies. As we discussed in the first week of this semester, the camera itself seems to have a tendency to portray what's in front of it realistically. The camera automatically creates realistic representations of the world around it. In this unit on modernism, we'll see filmmakers battling against that automatic realism of the camera, and they'll do so in a variety of different ways. We'll see them actively shaping mise-en-scène elements to make the world in front of the camera seem unreal. We will see them playing with disorienting cinematography and even making films without the use of cameras at all, working directly on celluloid. And we'll see modernist filmmakers take up really obvious and invasive, very non-invisible, non-continuous editing tactics to break the realist illusions of cinema. To talk about modernism, we're going to have to talk about realism and set it off against that. Now, we've really been talking about realism for the last few weeks without naming it as such. When we speak of realism in film, we're describing films that typically have that self-effacing storytelling that we focused on with Griffith, editing and cinematography that doesn't call attention to how it was made or constructed. That editing is nearly invisible. The world that we see in there seems to act like our world, or at least it's coherent and autonomous. It seems to behave in a rational way that are in keeping with our expectations and the information we have about this. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. There's usually a coherent organization of space and time. Often it's linear, or we get cross-cutting and flashbacks, but we're positioned within those flashbacks in such a way that it makes sense to us what's happening. The characters that we see have needs and desires and that are understandable to us and are communicated to us, and the narrative follows their actions and lead toward resolution, toward fulfillment of those desires. And continuity editing serves to absorb us into the film's world or narrative and helps us identify with those characters. And so continuity editing, as we've been talking about, is of course part of that realist mode of filmmaking. Most of what we've seen thus far this semester would easily fit into the realist mode and the realist tradition. Birth of a Nation is certainly a realist film. Much of why Griffith's film could have the political impact that it did was because of those invisible modes of storytelling that get the viewer to identify with the characters and to get swept up in the narrative without questioning it. Now, as we discussed, this film bases itself in a series of real historical events and distorts them and manipulates them and pushes them into fiction. But this has nothing to do with its connection to realism. Realism and fiction aren't opposites. Realism isn't synonymous with reality. Instead, it's a very conscious way of constructing a world that set it up so it seems real. Documentaries can be realist, but they don't have to be. So realism has nothing to do with sort of what's being depicted in them. You can have modernist documentaries as well. Realism is a kind of style. We can say that the early films we watched this semester, say by the Lumieres, were realist. But this is not because they were something like documentaries. Fantasies can be realist as well, rather because they conform to the ideas of realism, of not calling attention to storytelling process or to how they've been editing, to have coherent organization of time and understanding the characters and that characters behave according to evident logic and having, invisible editing. Or in the case of the Lumieres, really no editing. We might be tempted to think that fantasy is the opposite of realism, but that's not the case. Méliès's Voyage to the Moon has many elements that we would call unrealistic. There's aliens, people seem to breathe air on the moon and perform amazing magical acts, but this doesn't mean that they're realist. We have invisible editing, a story that sucks us in, characters who are intelligible in their desires, and actions that seem to behave according to a shared logic. Their world might not be just like our world, but we understand the rules of that world, that these guys have some magical powers, that they can get to the moon in this rocket, that Selenites will fall apart when you hit them with an umbrella. So the world then functions in accordance with these assumptions. Now, it might be hard to imagine the opposite of this, but as we watch films, particularly the surrealist films that we'll see in just a few videos, we're going to see that these are just assumptions. These are just stylistic tropes. These are choices for making film, not inherent qualities of film or of the only way things can be done. So for filmmakers as different as Lumiere and Méliès, we could call them both realist, even though one seems to be documentary and the other fantasy. Both Lumiere and Méliès use invisible processes of editing to create worlds that seem independent and autonomous. The worlds seem objective, and we could even say that Méliès's film uses more invisible editing, more of those tricks of continuity than we saw anywhere else up to the point that we watched that film. Both create cinematic awareness of depth. They have no edits or attempt seamless invisible edits. Neither fracture the story world by calling our attention to the process of filmmaking, of editing, or that authorial hand of the director. And so while Méliès may make fantasy films, they are still very much part of the realist tradition. So if we have to name an opposite to realism, it's not going to be fantasy, it's going to be modernism. As I've already mentioned, we'll see modernist films and filmmakers overturning and inverting the assumptions of realism, actively working against it. And all of these different movements of expressionism, Dada, surrealism, constructivism, they'll all do so in different ways. Not all modernist films are the same, and they will break with realism in very different ways. We'll see that expressionism will really take on mise-en-scène and to a certain extent cinematography as a way of playing with realism, where we'll get constructivism and surrealism playing with editing and cinematography as being ways of undermining realist assumptions. And Dadaist films will completely break with what we think film and film cameras do. And they'll break these elements while leaving other aspects of realism completely intact. Our story of modernism and its relationship to film won't start until really the 1920s. But modernism in the arts more generally started in the 18th century, just around the time when photography was being improved enough to start becoming something like film. So around the 1860s, 1870s. But we don't see modernism as a force in cinema until the post-war period, really, post-World War I. And this makes sense for a few reasons. First, because cinema was still being figured out. It wasn't clear what the rules of cinema were. If we imagine in 1915, kind of right before World War I begins, this is when Griffith is advancing all of the techniques that we talked about last time. So breaking the rules of realist cinema didn't seem like an option yet because those rules hadn't been fully established. And a second reason we can think of is that World War I really had a profound effect on all aspects of European culture. It amplified all of the crises of modernism, of industrialization, of technologization, and so on, as well as facing people with a really scary loss of life and physical destruction, as well as general existential crises. World War I was an incredibly devastating war for soldiers and for civilians alike. Male populations across Europe were decimated. Millions of people were disabled. Millions starved to death. 8 million European soldiers died in the war. 7 million were disabled. 15 million more were wounded. And more than 5 million civilians starved to death in Russia. More than 700,000 starved in Germany. And coming right on the heels of this, the influenza pandemic killed 50 million people. We also see a lot of new technological innovations, war innovations that appeared during this time that were particularly scary and strange, like tanks and airplanes and mustard gas. So war became technological. As you can see in this image of soldiers wearing gas masks, there was something dehumanizing and strange about war at this time. It wasn't like you were fighting another person so much as a force of technology. The generation of artists and filmmakers who had experienced trench warfare, who had grown up either during the war or fought as soldiers in the war, experienced these things: poison gas, machine guns, armored tanks, and other brutal forms of warfare that either brought them up close in conflict or seemed to facilitate enormous killing at a great distance. We'll see the kinds of existential alienation that was caused or exacerbated by the war and modernization in general fuel the aesthetic and narrative changes in film in this post-war period. Some of the characteristics of modernism that will set it apart from realism, we could sum up in these ways, and we can see them as being connected to some of those social, emotional, and political consequences of World War I that I was just speaking of. So we see fragmentation. The story world and the characters don't necessarily exhibit the qualities of coherence and consistency that we get in realist films. If we think about Birth of a Nation, everyone is almost single-mindedly committed to a kind of ideology, and they're unwavering in that. Won't get that same kind of conviction or commitment in modernist films. Time and space might be in disarray in these films. We'll jump back and forth across space and time, and characters will often be unpredictable and do uncharacteristic things, have odd urges and odd behaviors that aren't explained. Conscious and unconscious worlds can blend into each other in modernist films. We'll also see that a lot of modernist films invest in what we'd call formalism. So modernism across media and genres is an exploration of the properties and the limits of the material. It'll be self-referential in its exploration. We'll see this a lot in Soviet montage, and we'll see it in Dada as well. So formalism we can think of as artists considering what are the particular behaviors and conditions that are possible with film that aren't possible otherwise. Thinking about that celluloid, thinking about the material, and never letting that leave our consciousness. We also, in many modernist films, get heightened senses of subjectivity. So modernists often carry out these formal explorations in highly subjective styles while grounding this exploration in unconscious impulses and in personal visions that don't necessarily map onto an external or shared reality. Not all modernist films will have all of these techniques. They may just invest heavily in one. We'll see that German expressionist films in our next lecture invest heavily in heightened subjectivity and those ideas of fragmentation, whereas Soviet film is both fragmented, but in a different way, and formalist, thinking about breaking apart the actual surface of the film, the celluloid, into bits and editing it up in a really discordant way. So, despite falling all under one category, this broad category of modernism, there's actually a lot of diversity in modernist film. And our next few lectures, as we look at expressionism, Dada, surrealism, and constructivism, will show this great variety in modernist film. And we'll see that they're not all alike. And part of our work here will be teasing apart the types of modernism as well as their distinct differences from realism as we've been discussing it and seeing it so far.